Belladonna, 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 Belladonna. 青く透き通るこの肌を明日は愛のため捧げます春の花の下八台に赤く体染め抱かれますベラドンナ美しい女ベラドンナ恋をした女悲しみの足音はまだ聞こえてこないベラドンナ
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Third Impact Anime Podcast. I am your host for this episode. My name is Sully and I am joined today by Tobias.
Of Sadness.
And we are also joined today by Bill.
Of beautiful still frame artwork.
Kind of a longer title, but okay. And as you can maybe guess from the music that you just heard, or from our kitschy titles that we now have for ourselves apparently, we'll be talking about the classic film La Sorcière Kanashimi no Belladonna, or as it's known in English, Belladonna of Sadness. But before we get started into that, what have you guys been up to? We'll start with you, Tobias. What have you been watching, reading, playing, experiencing?
Life, every single day. But we have, of course, just gotten back from our convention weekend, so still processing Hamicon from about a week back here. As part of my my post-con therapy, I got back playing a Nier Automata, kind of picking that back up after a bit of a pause, and still really enjoying that. It's a really great game, really atmospheric, very very melancholic in a lot of places. Still not too far in that yet, so no spoilers yet. But I'm enjoying it for what I've played.
I've been wanting to play that game for a while. I always get sidetracked by so many things, but that game looks really cool, and I love the idea of multiple endings.
It's kind of a like an action RPG. It feels more action than RPG. Not to say there's no RPG elements, but it's very easy to pick up and play and just grind a little bit if that's what you want. But it's really easy to get lost in like the scenery. It's like I've got a point pretty early on in the game. It reminds me a little bit of like Dark Souls, where it's just very easy to take in the environment around you and kind of enjoy it that way.
I know that Tori apparently said, or somebody said that they were at GameStop and like the guy on the GameStop TV pronounces it like automata, and that was a thing, and that's all I know about that game is like the white-haired like gothic anime girl, and people call it automata.
Automatopoeia.
Automatopoeia. Near automatopoeia.
That's her name.
So when she punches and stuff, like the Batman, like biff wham pals come out. That's why it's called that. I
watched this movie in preparation for the podcast. Really behind, as is usual, on watching the new seasonal stuff, but I've got several shows that I'm really enjoying from that so far. Fire Force, of course, is good. It's enjoyable. I, for some reason, still have not sat down with Vinland Saga yet, even though I know that's the big thing that everyone likes.
It's so good.
So that's what I've heard. I started ironically watching How Heavy Are the Dumbbells You Lift, but I'm actually enjoying it. It's not as it's fan servicey, but not in the way that I thought it was going to be. And it's actually pretty educational as far as working out and exercising and whatnot. So it's kind of enjoyable in that regard.
How about you, Bill? What have you been up to?
Probably watching too much anime on top of the seasonal stuff that's going on right now. Especially Vinland Saga, which is my personal favorite. Partially because its opening theme song sounds like something during the new metal age, like Linkin Park would have probably performed the song.
Okay.
For Vinland Saga. So it makes me laugh every time. I've watched all the Pat Labor OVAs and highly enjoyed that. We will probably do a podcast on that in the near future.
Probably will.
But that song is the opening song for those OVAs is a jam and is so good. I watched Go-Go 13 The Professional, which is what if Canon Films made an anime? That would be Go-Go 13 The Professional. Is the way I would describe that movie. And I started watching the Galaxy Express 39 movie.
Okay.
Which I am really enjoying, because I could never really get into the TV series since the TV series is so long. But so far, I've been enjoying the movie. I haven't finished it yet, but I'm enjoying it.
I was going to say, you're pretty much doing the Austin method, where you watch 30 minutes and fall asleep.
Nope, I don't fall asleep. That makes me not Austin. I actually stay awake during my movies, sir.
Oh, wow.
Sir. And then games-wise, I don't know if you've heard of this game. It's kind of the Dark Souls of platformers. Psychonauts.
Psychonauts?
Yep, I've been replaying that game for the 1 millionth time, because I got it on my PlayStation for like 75 cents. And
wow.
so I said, I bought this game once again. I need to play it again to get me hyped for Psychonauts 2. And I've been trying to be more about the achievements, which I've never really been about that game. And I just love the small little details that they add to that game. Like there's a corkboard that you can just click on a button and read all these little notes of dialogue that they made. What's his name? Horowitz, who's the voice of Raz, who also is the voice of Zim in Invader Zim. Read with all the camp drama that's happening, which is kind of funny, and just all the little secrets they have throughout that game. That's one of my favorite games of all time. So
yeah, that's a good game. Eventually, we will get the sequel. Eventually,
Tim Schafer and his delays. Stop with the delays. That Microsoft money. Even though I hate that he took it. If it delays the game once again, I'm going to pull my hair out. So yeah, that's been my entertainment life as of late.
So how about yourself, Sully? What have you been engaging in lately?
So I feel like a lot of the stuff I've been watching has weirdly kind of been bringing me back around to Belladonna, because I've been watching a lot of French movies lately. I really got into a movie from 1970 called Peau d'Âne by Jacques Demy, and it's this sort of psychedelic adaptation of the fairy tale Donkey Skin. And I watched an interview with the director Anna Biller, I can speak, who did the movie The Love Witch, and she's like, "Oh, this movie Peau d'Âne really inspired me when I was making The Love Witch." So I'm like, "Oh, well, I have to watch that now." And that's a movie which was made in 2016, but is styled to be like a 70s film, and it's about this woman who engages in witchcraft and Wiccan practices in order to, and she makes love spells and uses her sexuality. She's sort of this femme fatale type. And then I watched Belladonna yesterday, or rewatched it, and I feel like I've been just kind of circling around the sort of like feminist, colorful, psychedelic fairy tale, sexy area for a while now, in just terms of the media I've been consuming. Other than that, now I've been accepted into grad school.
Woo! Nice.
And now I have 2 weeks between when I just left my terrible retail job I've had since I've been at home, and the 2 weeks between leaving that and moving into my new apartment to get ready to go to class. And in that 2 weeks, I have a huge list of anime and stuff I'm supposed to watch. I've marked some off my list. I was meaning to rewatch Belladonna because I had listened to a podcast, The Projection Booth, which is a film podcast I love. They did an episode on it. I was like, oh, I should rewatch it because it kind of inspired me to. So I got that down. I've been watching Ava on Netflix, and I had to stop because when I took my trip to San Diego, and took those days off at work, they ramped up my hours as a response to that before I left, and so I had to pause. I'm on episode 5 now, and so probably tomorrow I will start plugging back away at that, because that's something I probably should have been watching a long time ago.
Is this your first time watching through Ava?
So, last summer I attempted to watch it, and I forget why I stopped. And it's always been something I've been hesitant to get into, because I know that basically Ava is a very soul-sucking show, and that it leaves... I respond very emotionally to media that I watch, so if I watch something very depressing and very existential, I will probably feel that way afterwards, and so I've always been kind of hesitant to get very into it.
Yeah.
But with the new subtitled... the new sub job on Netflix, which has had its own sort of controversial thing, and I've just decided... I'm fine with the subtitles as they are, personally for me. I've done the research. I'm like, these are fine for me. And I'm going to watch the subbed version on Netflix just for convenience and because it's, a brand new translation. I'm willing to go into it blind, having only seen like 3 episodes before. So, yeah, this is my first watch, and I'm kind of bracing myself for it.
Where are you in Ava currently?
I know that he, left Nerve, and now the last scene I remember is when he's standing outside waiting, Shinji that is, waiting for Misato to come back and pick him up, and he's like, yeah, I'm going to join Nerve again after I left. So that's the last scene I remember very vividly. And I also planned to watch Banana Fish because everyone was talking about that. And I just participated in the Right Stuff sale. I had been watching Nadia and The Secret of Blue Water, and then I saw that the Blu-ray they did went down from $99 to $25, and I bought that. And I'm excited to continue that with the Blu-ray. And I got a manga at Comic-Con called A Witch Hat Atelier, which I haven't started yet, but I'm going to start that tomorrow. And in the Right Stuff sale, I also ordered the new Urusei Yatsura manga, and a manga called Go For It Nakamura, which is this sort of gay... It's almost like if Rumiko Takahashi wrote a BL, that's what this would be, supposedly. It's done in an 80s throwback style, and it's about this gay high school student who has a crush on one of his classmates, and he's trying to, deal with that. And I've heard people, go on and on about how cute and funny it is, so I'm like, I'll give it a shot. So that's kind of what I'm doing. I actually have this list next to me of stuff to watch in the next 2 weeks, and there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, there's probably about 15 things on here that consists of both anime and anime movies and just movies in general, and then books, and then comics, and then regular books to read. And I'm like, there's no way in 2 weeks I'm going to get all this done. So this is probably going to be an ongoing list. And that's not even counting games I want to play, because I really want to play Mario Maker 2.
Yeah, I should have a list, but it's just going to make me more depressed. Keep looking at that list. And
just recently today, I found the Utena musical up on YouTube subtitles, and I added that to my to-watch list. Will I get to it? God only knows. Oh, and I did binge Tuca and Birdie on Netflix after, the day I found out it got canceled. I'm like, well, let me see what the hubbub is, and now I'm sad.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of good things about that, too.
It's very, very surreal, very funny. I actually think it's better than BoJack, but that's just my hot take for the evening.
I will have to check that out, because I like surrealism, and I like BoJack Horseman.
Well, I've learned if people have a long backlog of stuff, you just have to be annoying and just poke them of just hey, you need to watch this. Tobias, you need to watch Fujiko Mine. Do it.
What was this show? This Lupin woman Fujiko something? You gotta keep telling me to watch. What's it called?
Yes, I believe her name is Fujiko Mine or something like that.
I think that's it. I'm not quite
Fujiko.
sure.
My Little Fujiko.
Exactly.
The lady named Fujiko Mine.
So I'm not really sure. There's this show that Bill wants me to watch, and he said the theme song is nothing but the main character's name repeated over and over again. You'd think I would remember it.
Someone asked me once, how do you get through like a long backlog? And I was like, it's the same answer that I give people who say, how do I find time to write? Or how do I find time to do something? It's, you just gotta make time. You know what? Like, there's always this answer of like, oh, well, you make a list and you set priorities. It's like, no, you just gotta make time. That's literally the only thing, is you have to, like, it's so easy nowadays because we have this, like, just this buffet of media to watch and things to watch. And I think we and I say this is someone who's just as bad. Like, when I was working in retail, every time I came home, I turned on, like, it was either Cheers, Frasier, Nailed It, or The Golden Girls. And it's like, you know what? I'm not really even watching it. I'm just going to turn it on and then, like, literally roll over in bed the other way and just have it play on the back while I try to go to sleep. And I think a lot of us have that sort of tendency to go for comfort shows or shows that we've seen 1,000 times or fandoms we're in that we don't really have to, engage ourselves with new media. And the answer is, well, you just have to make time where you sit up and you watch something, and maybe you have to do the awesome method where you watch it for 30 minutes and you fall asleep, you wake up and try to keep going.
Push it. You don't need sleep.
Just gotta push it. It's media calisthenics.
That's gonna be the quote of the episode.
So, with that, do we want to get into Belladonna of Sadness?
We are back for this week's episode. Again, we'll be discussing Belladonna of Sadness. Before we continue, I do want to give a quick warning here. Just due to the very nature of this movie, we're going to be discussing some heavy themes, including sexual violence. So just keep that in mind here. If you need to skip this episode, you certainly can do so. I don't think you're going to hurt any of our feelings. But just be advised that from this point on, we're going to be discussing some heavy material for sure.
Okay, and with that, we are going to jump right into Belladonna of Sadness, and we'll start out with some sort of background material. The full title, as I said at the top, is La Sorcière, Kanashimi no Belladonna. It's inspired by the book La Sorcière by Jules Michelet. It was translated into English as Satanism and Witchcraft, and it's a sort of romantic history on witchcraft in the Middle Ages and how it was sort of a way for women to fight back against a patriarchal society. Ultimately, though, he's like, and so men should, guide women so they don't do this. So it's kind of not a very feminist book. It's an interesting book to read. You can actually find the full text in English and in French online if you're so inclined. I read it personally, just out of my own curiosity. And there was an excerpt from the book, because again, this was the one that inspired the film, that I wanted to read here because I felt like it kind of neatly summed up sort of the plot and the theme of Belladonna of Sadness very easily. And this is from the chapter Satan the Healer. The sorceress was running a terrible risk. Nobody at the time had suspicion that, applied externally or taken in very small doses, poisons are remedies. All the plants which were confounded together under the name of witches' herbs were supposed ministers of death. Found in a woman's hands, they would have led her to being adjudged a poisoner or a fabricator of accursed spells. A blind mob, as cruel as it was timid, might at any morning stone her to death, or force her to undergo the ordeal by water or noyade. Or worst, and most dreadful fate of all, they might drag her with ropes to the church square, where the clergy would make a pious festival of it, and edify the people by burning her at the stake. So, fun stuff if you're into reading about witches. It was part of the Anime Rama trilogy, which, if any of you watched the Discotheque panel from Otakon, which was great, and I loved it, you'll know that they're actually releasing Cleopatra, which was the second of these films. So the first was 1001 Nights, Cleopatra, and then Belladonna of Sadness. These movies were made by Mushi Production, who was founded by Osamu Tezuka, the guy who made Astro Boy, Godfather of manga, the guy, kind of one of the reasons we're all here, basically.
Yeah. And
the whole reason this trilogy of films was made was basically, and in Japan at the time, there was the Pinku Eiga, the pink film craze, and pink film is basically... It's hard to describe it. It kind of defies description in some ways. It's sort of a combination of porn and exploitation film and women's revenge films, rape revenge films, gangster movies. They're these sort of the grindhouse films of Japan. They're very quick. They're short movies, usually like an hour or so long. And they were hugely popular. Like, men and women went to see them. People went on dates seeing pink movies. These sort of softcore, grindhouse exploitation violence movies. And they were really kind of also, like, pushing kind of the artistic sensibilities of Japanese cinema. Like, you have actual, like, the sort of intelligentsia of Japanese cinema talking about pink film seriously, and seeing it as sort of part of the nouvelle vague of film there. And so Tezuka saw this, and he saw these movies in the theater. He's like, well, how can we do this with animation? And so he did the anime Rama trilogy, starting with 1001 Nights, which people always compare these to Fritz the Cat. I don't think Belladonna is anything like Fritz the Cat, but they predated it. They actually predated it, I think, by 3 months or 3 years, something like that. So these are kind of like the example of kind of combining psychedelia and eroticism and so controversial themes in animation. And I will say that 1001 Nights is not that great. Cleopatra is... I mean, it's about aliens trying to become Cleopatra's lover, so, I mean, it's kind of out there, and it's psychedelic and weird, and it's enjoyable for that reason. But then you have Belladonna of Sadness, which I think is actually, like, art. Like, it is not, camp, it's not exploitation, necessarily. I don't think of it as a porn film. I think it's actual, honest-to-God art.
When you say things like exploitation, it makes me think of something that is, again, very campy, very set in that genre. But when you look at this, there are a lot of very specific stylistic elements. It shows it. How do I say this? It is very obviously a movie made in the 70s in a lot of ways, but I agree that it doesn't feel very exploitation-esque.
I feel like it has some of the tropes of pink film and of exploitation film, but it kind of does them in a more intellectual and artistic way. Like, I mean, it does have the elements of a rape revenge film, but it doesn't have that sort of male gaziness necessarily that something like Last House on the Left or what have you might have as an American example, or and this is a real film, I'm not joking. There's a pink film that has gotten some critical attention called Zoom In Rape Apartments, which has elements of sort of being a Japanese rape revenge film. And there's always this element of the lurid male gaze. And that's not really here. Like, everything in this film that is sexual and violent is absolutely terrifying and horrifying. And yet you can't look away. And it's not done with the sort of, the men in the audience, we have to keep them titillated. It's done with this, you, the audience member, are Jean. You are Belladonna. And we want you to feel as she feels. And I think that sort of empathy that the direction of this movie has is what separates it from something like Last House on the Left in many ways, where even if you could give a feminist interpretation, you cannot deny that there is a very implicit and very noticeable male gaze there.
Yeah, no, I would say, I feel like there's something, it's hard to describe as something that's very similar to the gaze here, but I feel like it's embodied more in the fact that the villagers are just so hesitant to go with the flow. They are there to support our characters when they are, benefiting from it, but they are also there to, watch as bad things happen to these characters. And I guess that feels kind of gazy in a way, in a very metaphorical way. But you're right, it's not very lurid. It's not it's not for a particular audience, I feel like. But it feels like, I feel like there's that element there that thematically it feels similar to, like, the male gaze.
It's interesting that you mentioned the villagers and how they kind of hesitantly go with things. I mean, even in the excerpt I read, a blind mob, as cruel as it was timid. I mean, that describes the villagers in this film. And the villagers, in many ways, kind of feel like the audience. They feel like they're supposed to be, we are supposed to feel what Jean feels, but I feel like at the same time the villagers are sort of us reacting to that world at the same time. They're sort of these silent witnesses to everything that happened. But we're getting really into this, but Bill, this was your very first time seeing this film, and you went into it completely blind. And first, I'm sorry, I thought you knew what it was about, but you went. So what was your reaction?
I hated the movie at first. I'm sorry. It's just because I didn't expect 3 or 4 rape scenes throughout the movie, and you are totally right. These, I would argue, after reflecting on it, these rape scenes are there for a purpose. They're not exploitative that you would see in like a Canon Films movie or in other exploitation type movies. But it was just it wasn't what I was expecting going in. So it was just kind of like. It was kind of like a slow-mo car crash of just like you can't look away and you're just watching it. And I'm going to say like it was hard. It was hard watching this movie because like you were saying, Sully, there's no real titillation in any of these scenes. It's just you are seeing it, I would say mostly somewhat from a distance, but also from Belladonna's perspective. Like, there's this one scene where her vagina just be ripped apart in one sequence, and you're just seeing that just this like, ugh, it's painful. And I would say I'm glad we did this trigger warning before we started the conversation, because I think going into this movie you need to know what is happening, because I think going in cold really affected my viewpoint on the movie until I had time to reflect on it.
And I will say this is a difficult movie to watch for a variety of reasons. One being the content of the film itself, and two, it's not a traditionally animated film. Like if you're expecting like an on the ones like Akira or like a Disney movie or like anything that you might be used to with Tezuka, it's not. It's mostly it's a lot of static images and pan shots and fadeaways and very limited animation done artistically. So if you're looking for something that's like a very strict animated narrative, you're not going to get it here.
But those static images are gorgeous. Like the opening, the opening sequence of our two main characters, them getting married, just everyone gathered around them, and when they go to the Lord's court, just wow, just the character designs and how everyone looks. It's like an oil painting, just very beautiful.
I've seen people compare the artwork in this movie to Klimt, who's famous for his piece The Kiss, and sort of the Art Nouveau of France of the 20s, and then it's sort of like if you took Art Nouveau and Klimt and Yoshitaka Amano and Chuck Jones and said, let them all have a jam session. I feel like this movie would be the result. And I mean, think of like it's literally every frame a painting in its most sort of taking that to the extreme. I think I would love an art book, or even just imagine if the cells or the paintings used for this film are still extant. Like imagine like a gallery exhibition of these. Like it'd be breathtaking.
I would get that art book for sure.
Same.
Yeah, and I think kind of what you said. This is the second time I've seen the movie, maybe the third, and I did pay attention to the animation itself. And there's, at least the very first half of the movie, there's very limited animation. It really is just sort of these pan and scan shots of these gorgeous like watercolor illustrations. That you're right, and all the production art we'll see from this. Like if you just Google Belladonna of Sadness and look at the screenshots, it's pretty much what you're going to get out of this. The animation itself, for those parts that are animated, it definitely seems like something animated in the 70s. The animation looks a little dated. There's a part later in the movie where it very is obviously something from the 70s with a very schoolhouse rock aesthetic to it, which is very different than the rest of the movie, of course. But yeah, like I completely agree that the strength of the aesthetics here is going to be in these still frames.
Actually, this just kind of got me thinking of maybe it's a narrative technique throughout the movie, because thinking about it, when it's just the still static frames, everything's kind of peaceful, it's calm, it's quiet. When there's animation going on, it's either something frantic is going on, either Belladonna interacting with the villagers, curing them with their bubonic plague, or the sexual violence that occurs to her, or her interactions with the devil.
The imagery in those are done so well. I mean, not to dwell on a very unpleasant topic, but I think how the assault scenes are done, because her body is literally torn from the groin, and you see this red abscess representing the tear, and then it begins to throb like an organ, and it's so uncomfortable and so visceral, and you can feel it. And then, even the design of the devil, it's very obvious. He's very obviously a penis, a phallus. And when he appears, and like his first appearance, when he starts out this sort of little phallus imp, he appears in like this white smoke. To me, this looks like semen. It looks like he's appearing in a cloud of semen, and then he, the imagery is it's not subtle necessarily, but it's done very painstakingly in a sort of, we know what we're doing, but we're going to do it well.
Exactly. And I think another thing to point out, for those of you who haven't maybe watched it yet for some reason, that a lot of these scenes almost feel like they're straight out of a picture book. There's a lot of these plain white backgrounds with these scenes, drawn, illustrated over them. There's a lot of juxtaposition in some of the outlines. So there's one scene in particular that stands out in my mind where we see, Belladonna's face, but like her hair and her bangs, they're just white. They're just white outline, or rather they're like black outlined, but you don't actually see the hair color. And there's a lot of stylistic choices like that I think really make this movie pop visually in a lot of those still frames.
And when you bring up it being a storybook, it kind of makes me think of, the very beginning of the film starts with Jean, and they have very similar sounding names in French, but and her name isn't Belladonna, but that's a good way. We'll probably refer to her as such just for clarification in the audio. But when her and Jean are getting married, it's got this sort of happy song, and all the villagers are there. It feels like, and then they lived happily ever after. Well, what's ever after is not actually that happy. It feels like we've kind of arrived at the end of the fairy tale, and now this is where the tragedy begins. And our narrator kind of sets it up in that way, which I found very interesting. It is kind of like, this is what happens at the end of the storybook that you're not privy to. This is the dark side of the fairy tale.
Yeah, there's no fairies here. It's just all medieval awfulness.
I mean, they kind of invoke the feeling of the fair folk in a way. I mean, look at the royal court. Like, the lord, he has these horrific bone protrusions in his head, and the woman looks like this sort of, evil queen from outer space, and all of their courtiers are like these, they have these bizarre body proportions and weird hair colors. They feel kind of like this band of freaks that are in charge of all the people. And then all the villagers themselves, they kind of look like Cupid dolls. Like, they have like little round blush cheek things, and they have little beady eyes, and they look so dumb, like little Santa elves or something. And then the only like real human characters are Belladonna and Jean. They're the only ones who look like humans consistently throughout the movie.
And the other thing too is kind of going on the end of the fairy tale. It's a very dark fairy tale of everyone in the movie, except for Belladonna, are very selfish. Of just, if it helps us, it's great. But like the villagers throughout the movie are very passive. Like, they don't, when Belladonna is sexually assaulted, they don't try and help. Or when John is inside their house and Belladonna is banging down the door, please let me in, they're coming after me. and he is too much in a broken state within his own mind to do anything.
Right.
And also just the members of the court are very vain of what the villagers are following Belladonna to get rid of. We need to get rid of her. It must be witchcraft, or the queen also being very petty of she can't be more beautiful than I. So it's a very dark fairy tale.
I think at this point we maybe need to give a little bit of the plot, because we've kind of described things, and people who have not seen this movie will be very confused. So the basic plot of Belladonna of Sadness is, as I said, it begins with the wedding of Jean and Jean, who have very similar names, but they're different in French. And they are in the French medieval countryside, and they're married, and so the lord of the land, who is only ever referred to as my lord, he requires that all people who are married give him a tax of 10 cows, and her husband says they only have one, and he says, well, the other price is if your wife is a virgin, and she is, then you must give her to me. And then the lady of the court even says, and after he has his way, everyone else in the court can have her as well. And that gets us into our first assault scene. And she is sort of broken by this, and her husband is despondent now. And one night, while she's sort of crying and coming to terms with what has happened to her, this phallic imp, this devil, comes to her and offers her great power, saying, I am part of you, and enchants her spinning wheel. And if there's any other, if there are any greater symbology or, symbol of fairy tales than the spinning wheel, I can't think of one. And her thread that she makes, she does, she spins, fetches this great price, and they're able to pay their taxes, and because of that, her husband is then made into a tax man. And basically, the film goes is that she becomes more entwined with the devil and witchcraft, and she becomes entwined with the devil and witchcraft the more that she sort of faces this patriarchal oppression, this sexual oppression. The more that she, does this, the more power she gains through the magic that this devil who is giving her through sex in many ways. And finally, she becomes this witch. Her husband loses his hand, and she sort of runs off and becomes a witch, and she gives people potions that can induce abortions, can remove pain. She sort of becomes a healer type, and because this threatens the power of the Lord, he tries to take her out, and eventually she's taken into the town square, and she's burned as a witch. And it's implied that her sacrifice is not in vain, that her spirit will, inhabit women of France, and when the revolution comes, centuries later, it's the spirit of the Belladonna of Sadness that will carry them forward, because one of the last lines of the film is this text that says, and at the very front lines of the revolution, there were the women. And that's sort of in a nutshell the plot. There are some more intricacies there, but to understand what we're going to be talking about, that's pretty much all you need to know.
I would argue that this film is not, there's a plot, but it's more character, what's happening to Belladonna and her journey from becoming just a young married woman to becoming a sorceress, a Wiccan, a witch, however you like to describe it, and just the journey she goes through and the pain that she takes. So overall, I don't view this movie as a plot-heavy narrative, although I do hate that ending of, and they somehow tie it to the French Revolution, because I think it takes away from that fairy tale element. I think it was very jarring to me when you're like, huh? So her death helps give people the power to fight the patriarchy during the French Revolution? Okay. I kind of hated that part.
It made it feel a little weird, because nobody really wins the movie. Nobody really, I guess, comes out okay. Everybody suffers to some way, even the bad guys at the end of it. So I guess the general theme was, life was really, really shitty for women back then. Any sort of power you obtained was taken away by, the institutions around you, whether it be these feudal lords or just men in general. And, this is where we would see things turn around in France a little bit later. I guess is a way to make it a little happier, because there's no joy in this movie up until that point.
I mean, it's not Belladonna of Sunshine and Rainbows. One thing I find interesting is just the more she is degraded, the more humiliation and pain and suffering she's put through, the more powerful she becomes. And it's just interesting how this film sort of uses how it views sex. And most of the time when you see a movie, it's sex good or sex bad. And here it feels like sex is simply, people can use it to hurt you. You can use it as a tool. You can use it as a tool for pleasure. It feels like it's kind of exploring all of the avenues that sex can take, instead of simply saying, like, this isn't like a Lifetime movie where, there's a sexual assault and then there's no, sex is always bad and it's sort of bemoaned as constantly bad. Or it's not like a sort of very hippie film where it's like all sex is good all the time. It feels like it actually takes like a nuanced, critical look at how sex is a tool in society. And I find it very interesting the first time the devil comes to her. One, he's in the shape of this small phallus. Two, he says, I am a part of you. You summon me because I am a representation of your feelings. And it's like the very first, sort of pleasant sex scene in the film, if you can call it that, because there are no real sex scenes here. They're very metaphorical and very surreal and psychedelic. There's no actual, like penetration or anything in the traditional sense. But the very first sort of pleasant, erotic scene that we have is him saying, I am a part of you, I am doing this of your own will. And it's sort of this, is this an implication for masturbation? Is this phallus, is it like a dildo thing, which also goes into the witchcraft, the idea of like witchcraft is also representing feminine sexuality, the freedom of feminine sexuality, the story of the witch broom being something that came from that. And it's such a complicated thing because you start with that, with the devil and that, and then the devil seems to assault her later. And it's like there's always this feeling of, as empowered as she is by this, there's always a price that someone will be paying down the line.
Well, I think the greater message is sex is the ultimate form of power of who is controlling the sex. Like throughout the movie, the people who hold the power are the people who are controlling the sexual intercourse. For example, when they don't have enough to pay for the when they don't have enough to give to the Lord says, okay, then I get to have sex with your wife. And that is a form of power of I am able to dominate over you and control who you get to have sex with. Or when the devil comes in of just like, in order for you to have this power, you must give yourself to me, mentally and sexually. And I think that's kind of the theme that stuck with me throughout the movie is sex, and who controls that sexual interaction is the ultimate form of power.
I find it interesting you bring up when the devil says that, but at the same time, I think either in that scene or another one, he says, I do not want those poor souls who throw themselves at me. There's something about you, that your defiance or your independence that I want. And I found that to be a very fascinating line, kind of, in relation to everything else in the movie. It's just a really complicated. I feel like you could watch this movie 3 times and find new ways of interpreting it and new ways of looking at it. Because this is probably one of the first times in a while I've sat down and watched this, start to finish. And I just kept writing down, like, what does this mean? What does this mean? What? It's like I'm trying to figure out this riddle. This movie is, posing me. And so much of it seems to be in relation to the church, too. So much of the traditional witches' Sabbath that has been outlined through things like the Malleus Maleficarum, or through, La Sorcière, the book that this film was inspired by, tends to take the sacraments of Christianity, of Catholicism, the traditional traditions, that's the oxymoron, the rites of that religion, and sort of sexualizing them and subverting them, like, the act of kissing the ring of the Pope. For witches, it said that to become a witch, you have to kiss the ass of Satan. And that sounds funny to us, but it was a sexual subversion of the tradition that was supposedly part of black magic. Women's sexuality was inherently linked to their rebuking of Christ and their gaining power from demonic forces. And in this film, it's weird because she sometimes seems to be embracing Satan as this sort of lover figure, and then sometimes it feels like he's just another male that is harming her. So even through witchcraft, this thing is positioned as a way of women subverting male authority and finding freedom. If in this film we position witchcraft as receiving powers from Satan, and Satan is represented as a male figure and literally as a phallic figure, is she truly free by witchcraft if ultimately her power comes again from man?
And another thing to sort of add to that is there's not, in most of the scenes with the devil here, he doesn't really force her. There's only the one scene where he appears and is laying on top of her, but when she actually vocalizes that she didn't want it, he was like, okay, that's fine, I'll leave and I'll come back when you do. So there's a brief scene where it could turn into something, but it really doesn't. And and later in the scene later where she finally does embrace it, like, that is entirely her choice. She decides to do that, and then we get this really weird scene where they melt together, and there are real life video bubbles in the background, and then Schoolhouse Rock shows up for some reason. But I like that is entirely consensual at that point. So at that point, the devil has won, and that she has decided that yes, this is what she wants.
It's interesting how we sort of frame her. I don't want to use the term partners, especially since some of the sex scenes are non-consensual. But the people who engage in sex with her, we have the Lord who violates her. And then we have her husband, Jean, who we have one sort of tender love scene between them at the end, but it feels like it's this sort of marital, this sort of sterile affection they have. I mean, it does feel very much like a fairy tale, very childish, and like, oh yeah, we're together, and it's all sunshine and rainbows, and it's just sort of like the breeding pair must go off unfettered. And then you have her with the devil, and it's like, this is the actual lover that she has, this person who actually makes love to her, doesn't violate her, have this sort of sterile, sort of Disney-esque look at it. It's like, out of all the people that she has relations with, why is Satan the most satisfying for both sort of psychologically and physically?
I mean, I feel like that's kind of answered through the film itself. At the very beginning, they're these very generic fairy tale lovers. They're very chaste, very white, very pure. And then when things start going down, that's when they lose their innocence. And I feel like we talked earlier about male gaze, but there is a lot of commentary on male entitlement at the beginning and throughout the film as well. While John, I mean, he's honestly more ruined by the initial rape than she is. Not to say that it wasn't, traumatic on her end, but I felt like he was definitely more impacted, than she was in the beginning.
You know what I think that is? I think that's because he loses his form of power, or his power within that relationship.
Oh, exactly. I mean, that comes down to that male entitlement. So the first act is, of course, the Lord that takes what is, quote unquote his. There's John that feels she's ruined, and that there goes my life. Oh, woe is me for, having done the situation done to me, which of course, is wrong. It wasn't him to begin with. But we see that kind of throughout. It's this male entitlement. And even later, when the whole tax collector scene, where John just sort of stumbles into this job that pays well, and then when the Lord goes off and suddenly they need money, it's everyone feels entitled to the Belladonna's skill, and what was it, weaving? I think the skill she picks up. However, everyone feels entitled to her wealth, even the queen or the baroness or whatever her actual title is feels entitled to that. But of course that all goes away when the Lord comes back and suddenly they can find cause to get rid of the Belladonna. And even in the end, everyone is so happy to partake of the Belladonna's skill and the skill in the witch's herbs. But lo and behold, when suddenly everyone turns against her, they are not remiss about doing that. They are very quick to either burn her or allow her to get burned. So I feel like that's, I mean, we see it though. Again, not to say that any of these characters are actually suffering more than she is, because she certainly does. But she certainly has a stronger fortitude than any of them do.
And historically, that was pretty much how witches or the healer woman existed in many sort of pre-modern societies. I mean, at least for Ray Bradbury, one of the main ideas of where the word witch comes from is it comes from wits, the person who knows something. And these women who knew how to heal or knew these sort of folk remedies were kind of in this weird limbo between, people seek my services, but they don't respect me because they've been taught to fear me. It's similar to what Jean faces when she becomes this healer. We have the old woman who comes and says, I like to have sex with my husband, and if I don't want children, she gives me this herb that allows me that works as a sort of contraceptive, sort of an after pill, and I know it's sinful, but I want to do it anyway. And Jean sort of acts as this sort of, I can place my sin onto her. I did this, but it was through her, so it's all her fault. This sort of, and it kind of is the thing that allows the villagers to sort of sit by quietly when she's being executed, at least until then they sort of rise up, and then the knights keep them back. It's easy to vilify them, but in a way they're kind of stuck between, she could empower them, but to what extent are they actually able to carry out any sort of, revolution? It's like when they burn the Belladonna, her husband Jean, he takes one of the flaming logs off the fire and tosses it at the Baron, and they kill him. They throw a spear through him, and the villagers rise up and they go to attack, and then they're met with the spears of the knights. And so this is sort of I kind of view the villagers as these sort of dumb children that she kind of has to take care of, and they kind of are capricious, but that's only because they're stuck between her trying to sort of liberate them and the aristocracy trying to keep them down. It's even one of the ladies' pages comes to her for help, and it's this sort of I think you're disgusting, but I need your help.
And there's a political metaphor there of the villagers, aka the people, would rather stay in complacency because going and forming a rebellion causes unrest, gets rid of stability, and it gets rid of comfort and safety. And so by allowing the Belladonna to be burned, they can still be safe and go about their boring lives, even if they are under our oppressive ruler.
And to just kind of go back through the sexual history of the show, I feel like one thing that she does uncover is just how fake these structures of power are, how they're pretty much mandated by sexual intercourse to some degree, whether it's the Baron taking what he feels is his, whether it's Jean sort of giving up on the Belladonna because she's tainted. I think what she learns at the end after embracing Satan is that it doesn't really matter, and it's really a matter of how you feel about it. So when she is more than happy to welcome any of the villagers to accept her remedies, and then John shows up, I do think it's kind of a mix of embracing him as an ex-lover, as someone she loves or used to love, and not letting the jealousy get a hold of her, letting them just have that moment, as actual lovers for that one time. And that it's, even if it's more there for comforting him as it is for, her enjoying herself. I feel like she's realized that all that crap that held her back to begin with is not really anything except what you make of it.
And it's funny that her husband, John, he kind of, the very first sort of witchcraft that she has is selling the thread. It's mentioned by the narrator that, she could sell it at any price she wanted and no one would haggle. Apparently the thread has some sort of enchantment that allows it to be sold, to be made wonderfully and be sold, without question. And because of that, they're able to pay their taxes, and the Baron makes Jean the tax man, and he kind of, lives off of her labor, basically. And then the next enchantment she has, where she becomes this healer, he becomes a drunk. It's funny, the first time it happens, he's, taking power from her labor, and the second time, when she's more in control of the sort of fruits of her magic, he's emasculated and he has no ability to defend for himself, and then he becomes a weakened person again, and, even though she never sort of banishes him or sort of casts him out, we in the audience, I'm like, why do you like him? He's such a weak man that he can't handle you, living your own life, and he's become this drunk now that you're powerful. It's like, I don't know why she kind of comes back to him in the end. Even though she does do a little bit of flirting, after the Black Plague happens, there's the man that finds her in this cave, and she sort of offers him this magical flower by way of, she sort of tries to kiss him with the potion in her mouth and flirts with him. It's just kind of funny to me that all the men in this movie are so easily threatened by women's power, and then the two sort of women in the movie, Jean, the Belladonna, and the Baroness, they're the two that kind of have they have the strictest competition. The actual Baron, after he assaults her the first time, he goes off to war, and then a lot of the conflict in the narrative comes from the Baroness and Jean facing off against each other now that she has taken over more power than her, and the people revere her more and they fear her more. So it's even sort of going into this competition between women in a patriarchal society.
Getting whatever scrap he can at the table.
Yeah.
That women were allowed to have.
I feel like as much as we frame the Baron as the main villain, and he is a villain to be sure, he's in the story so little compared to the lady who is egging him on through most of this and, agreeing with him, and then she sort of takes a more direct violence against Jean than any other character outside of a sexual assault. Like, in terms of a narrative, I'm trying to undo you, she's the one that seems to have the most out for her. It seems the Baron is really just in for the carnal pleasures of taking her body for his own.
Yeah, he's just a brute force, the brute force of the patriarchy, whereas his wife seemed a little more of a human villain in that regard.
It reminds me a bit of sort of, talking about The Handmaid's Tale. You have the women in that society who are who kind of, I don't know if you could say agree, but they support this oppressive patriarchal dystopia, and they do it for their own selfish needs, whatever those might be. And I feel like that kind of character is the sort of character that the Baroness is. It's that she does not see this as, I should protect her for being a woman, or my being a woman, I understand the sort of thing they're trying to do to her. She's not, when the assault happens the first scene in the movie, she does not say, no, don't do this is wrong, or even turn a blind eye to it. No, she encourages, and even she is the one that says, when he is done, that is when the servants can have their turn. She's encouraging it. Right. And I feel like that speaks volumes as to where she's positioned in this story, and where, women are placed in relation to each other in this movie.
You said that earlier, how they are pretty much rivals, and it's very easy for individual women to embrace the patriarchy in that regard, because they can still benefit from it, but not that benefits people as a whole, but just their particular situation at that moment.
So we've done a lot of really heavy talking here. This is a very Kino episode of Third Impact Anime.
There goes our outline. We pretty much just skipped over half of it.
Yeah. Maybe we should talk a little bit about the cast here.
Yeah, I think we kind of skimmed over our discussion questions. We can go in a little more in depth because I do want to explore some. But I guess if we're taking a bit of a break here to let everything sink in. Let's go over first the cast list. So we have playing the devil, or Satan, or the little phallic imp, as Sully's new favorite phrase. We have Tatsuya Nakadai, who is also in Sumiyaki no Rojin in Tales of Princess Kaguya, the Ghibli film. He also looks like was Lord Hiratore Ichimonji in Ran, and Unosuke in Yojimbo. Now, which Yojimbo was that? Bill, I think you put this list together.
Yeah, that's. I think that's
the live action Kurosawa.
These Ran and Yojimbo are the two live action Akira Kurosawa movies. He was in 5 Akira Kurosawa movies, actually. So,
Okay.
He's a very well-known character actor in Japan, isn't he?
just going through his cast list, it seems that he was very popular among a lot of the top Japanese live-action directors at the time.
Okay, so got experience of both live-action and voice actor work. Moving along, we have Aiko Nagayama as Jean, the Belladonna, as we are calling her for this episode to make things a little easier. We have Katsutaka Ito as Jean, or just John.
I mean, basically in French it is just John. It's John and Jean, basically.
Yeah, John and Jean. That's a good way to... I think that's how my internal monologue was voicing it along with the movie. We have Masaya Takahashi as the Lord, the Baron, the King, whatever title. I don't think he's officially titled in the movie, at least the subtitles I watched, but he's just the head honcho, the head noble. And his wife is played by Shikaku Shimegi. These actors and actresses don't really have a whole lot of history, not that we as an American audience would really be familiar with, but they all were in a number of live-action Japanese works as well.
These were mostly live-action actors, so these weren't voice actors, really.
Right. Yeah, and again, this was made in the 70s, so there wasn't quite the the base of voice actors and actresses that we have now. So that is understandable, I would say. But moving right along into the production staff, we mentioned earlier that this is a series of films by Mushi Production, Osamu Tezuka's studio. Now, after working on the first two films, Tezuka did leave before completing Belladonna, as he wanted to focus more on his manga work rather than the animation, which I think is a solid choice. This doesn't feel very much like a Tezuka work, and I think a lot of his manga is fairly timeless. He deserves a lot of the attention that he still gets, so I think that was a smart choice on his part. But as far as the actual staff members for this movie, we have the director is Eiichi Yamamoto. Previously also worked on Tezuka's work Astro Boy, as well as Space Battleship Yamato. The Cleopatra film had directly preceded this. And Kimbo with the White Lion, another Mushi Production work. The co-writer on this, alongside Yamamoto-san, is Yoshituki Fukuda, who also worked on Akira, Cat's Eye, and Wicked City. We have for the animation director Gisaburo Sugi, who, apart from working on Cleopatra previously, also worked on the 60s Dororo adaptation. Again, another Tezuka adaptation. Also directed, what is this, Bill? One of the Lupin movies or specials?
Yes, this is one of the specials, Lupin the Third, The Twilight Gemini, which is the only reason why this one's notable is because there's a sex scene between Fujiko and Lupin, which is overblown.
Is he just as psychedelic as Belladonna?
Do they start teaching us about how conjunctions work, or how I'm just a bill and I'm sitting on Capitol Hill?
That would make it actually interesting and make that movie actually memorable. It's really bad.
And moving along, we have Yukiya Chida. Worked on in-between animation for this film, but it also worked on key animation for Night on the Galactic Railroad, and Unico and the Island of Magic, and also Space Adventure Cobra, which, speaking of discotheque announcements, this is a very timely podcast. We did just get an announcement that the movie, Space Adventure Cobra movie, is going to be the first anime in 4K UHD format over here in the States. Just recently, Discotheque is making history in a whole different regard.
Yep, Discotheque is basically just, as we've discussed, the criterion of anime at this point.
We are unabashedly here at Third Impact Anime Team Discotheque all the way.
Yep. If you haven't, for whatever reason, had a chance to check out the Discotheque announcements from yesterday, it's just as surprising as they usually are, so feel free to check that out. I think we would all recommend following them on social media, and just following them in general. Because Discotheque Day, every Otakon, is a national holiday for otaku.
One other note about this movie, just kind of in my research, is unfortunately this movie bankrupt Mushi Productions and kind of shut down the studio because it did not do so well in Japan, and it did not get any international play until much later.
Oh, yikes.
So Mushi Productions did come back, although in a different form.
moving right along here, let's kind of move into our general discussion outline. So the first question, I think we've pretty much outlined at the beginning of the podcast. What did you think about the general art style and aesthetic? I know we talked about the watercolor illustrations and the actual panning, the pan and scan throughout. Is there anything else you guys wanted to add to that?
If you are really into kind of 60s psychedelia and kind of pop art, you'll probably love the art style of this movie. I would love to have a time machine, somehow take this movie back, do a screening of it in San Francisco in the midst of the 60s revolution, and see how an audience would take to this movie, because I think they would love it from an artistic perspective.
Personally, I think it's beautiful. Like, I went into it and I knew that the animation was limited in places, and I think that's part of its charm. I think that gives it that storybook feel we were talking about, and I know some people, especially if they maybe have watched this after, like, Cleopatra or 1001 Nights, they would be turned off, but I think that they knew what they were doing, and that it's well directed. It's just beautiful. Like, I cannot imagine... Like, I watched this on the big TV in our living room, and just watching it restored and on that big high definition, it was just gorgeous. It was absolutely beautiful. And I can only imagine how it must look in a theater. Like, it must be breathtaking to see it on the big screen in the dark. I cannot recommend the visuals in this film enough. And I am into that psychedelic, surrealist pop art aesthetic, so it was right up my street.
I absolutely love the Schoolhouse Rock scene in particular. It's just so wacky. It's so weird and so unlike the rest of the movie. We talk about the storybook look and feel of the general movie up until that point, but it's just such a disconnect to have that happen. And then not even a few minutes after that, where they're having that orgy from the villagers. It's like a 70s version of the club scene from Devilman Crybaby.
Let me reiterate, there's a scene where a man's penis turns into a woodpecker and begins to peck at his butt.
Yeah. And another one where, like, the guy's genitals become a giraffe, and another guy is, like, defecating fish. Fish are just popping out of his butt constantly.
I think there's one woman, her breasts turn into eels or something.
Yeah, all I could think about is Devilman Crybaby, and like how similar that was just 30, 40 years earlier. Okay, the one I think when we're kind of stuck on this, I want to give my one complaint of the movie. I feel like the pacing is a little off. I hear a lot of people, and I think I've heard both you guys mention. At least Sully, I think, sort of implied this. Maybe not Bill. That you will, like, watch this movie in chunks rather than watching it all in one go. That was kind of how I watched it initially. And there are parts of this movie where I feel like there's a lot of repetition. There's a lot of, all right, here's this terrible thing that happens to her. Here's how she gets back. And here's how the power responds. And there's like 3 loops of this that it makes me feel like there's a lot of false endings and the movie keeps going.
It's funny, the runtime for this movie is only 88 minutes.
Yeah, and there's that too, and it was so, like, I felt like I was watching a 2.5 hour Lord of the Rings movie. I don't want to say it dragged, and sure there were a lot of visually stunning elements. I'm glad nothing was cut out of it, but it's still, I don't know, this, like, it felt like it dragged.
Well,
Is that just me, or?
No, I think that's the pacing at the time. Like, trying to go back to a movie that's 70s or earlier, it can be hard to go back to. So I think at the time audiences had more of a patience, where now we're so used to stuff that's more fast and kinetic because we're always moving on to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing. So we need something that's pretty fast paced. Whereas
those psychedelic scenes, they're not short. Like, they last 2 or 3 minutes each, and I think that kind of adds to the feeling of length when it's a scene that doesn't really have a direct point to it. It's just there for you to visually enjoy it. I think that can make it feel longer, but I was just kind of like, wash it all over me, just throw it at me, movie. And like, even the scene with the Black Death, with these sort of ghoulish black faces that sort of float in and out and look over them. I mean, I was just like, you know what? I'm just going to enjoy it and just like take in the craft of the animation. I think if you go in with that mindset of, you know, I'm watching this, and when I get to these scenes, I'm going to enjoy it like one would enjoy in a fine dinner. You're going to get your money's worth.
I think I've mentioned this before, but my only real complaint with the movie is just I think that the ending of "and Belladonna's death inspired the French Revolution," I think is kind of a bunch of BS, because one, the villagers don't really show that through the movie. Two, it takes away from the fairy tale element, and I think it was them trying to, like, oh crap, this movie is extremely depressing. We should add a kind of a hopeful ending that felt tacked on. So I kind of wish they had just ended at her Belladonna's death.
You know what would have made the movie a lot better? You know how those late '80s Rat Pack style movies where it's like, where are they now? And right before the credits plays, it shows each character and like what kind of goofy thing they grew up to do or whatever. That's what it should have been, Bill.
Well, Belladonna, she's dead. The villagers, they're dead. John, he's dead.
Played under a very peppy 80s tune.
Exactly. It would have been like The Breakfast Club.
Hey, 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 hey,
It would have been called the Belladonna Club.
And then Belladonna writes a letter to, and we learned while I was burning at the stake.
I'm surprised Sully hasn't yelled at us yet.
Oh no, I'm letting the art happen.
Kino, absolute Kino.
Absolute Kino.
The next point, I think we covered a lot in the discussion about Satan and just the general morality. But when we look at like Japanese mythology and how they look at demons or yokai, they're not strictly black and white, good and evil, like they are in more Christian stories that we see here. There's a lot of Christian elements, a lot of that religious background, and in this story in particular, and in the original story this is based on. So I feel like even though we've got Jean the Belladonna as dealing with the devil throughout, I don't feel like we see a lot of this corruption symbolism throughout. It feels like she's a very sympathetic character by the end. Did you guys sort of get that, or did you feel that there was some corruption there that sort of doomed her and covered her character arc?
I'm going to say, as someone who has never really had a very close relationship with Western religion, for reasons that might be obvious to some people, I never had a moment where I thought, oh, this is a corrupt character. No, I was completely on her side, and completely on Satan's side for the entire film. Like, except for the points where I was like, okay, Satan, you can back off. She said no. Other than that, like, for the most part, I'm like, you know what? I was like, well, why aren't you selling your soul already? Like, he's offering you power. I'm not religious personally, and I don't believe necessarily in Wicca or anything, but I always, in stories, I love witches. I love reading about witchcraft. I love reading stories about witches, be they like the Wizard of Oz style, where they're just, pointy hats and cackling, or like the more realistic, or the fairy tale style. So, like, my sympathy always lies with the witch almost 100% of the time. So there was never a point for me where I was like, oh yeah, she's fallen, she's given up. I'm like, no, you're fighting back, you're reclaiming your power, you are embracing your feminine sexuality, you are owning your body, you are owning your abilities, you are learned, you are powerful. And that scene, like, one visual from the movie I love is that scene where I think it's when the lady first sees her in her full witch form, and she looks like this black beast, where she has this regal long neck and the horns, and her body sort of turns from an animal to a robe, and she like glides up and she just looks down. I was like, that was my favorite visual moment in the film, because it's like, that is how I feel Belladonna, how Jean actually is, this powerful sorceress who is, you can destroy my body, but my spirit will live on in the bodies of every woman that you try to oppress. Feminism.
I think for me, I grew up in a Christian family. It was hard to get away from my view on heaven and hell and the Christianity lens through it. Now, I would agree that the devil is not necessarily evil, but the idea of you're losing your purity, quote unquote, and the devil is unleashing this power and this wildness to you. I could see the kind of the Christian theming through that. It's not exactly Christian, but that's kind of how I interpreted it.
I mean, and honestly, I wasn't exactly referring to this as being like how you view it through your own religious lens, although I think adding that did add something to the conversation. I guess that when we're used to these kinds of stories in a Western framework, very inspired by, some might even say tainted by, very conservative Christian mindset. I feel like usually when they get these stories, the devil is usually their corrupter, and usually by the end, the tempted person falls down to the depths of hell or is corrupted. But I feel like in this movie, we didn't see that. I was kind of expecting near the end for there to be a catch, for Jean to do something despicable and maybe murder everybody or do something very evil. But she doesn't. Even at the end, all she wants to do is to help her village, the same village that's kicked her to the curb several times.
I think an interesting story to compare this to is Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, where, you know, the dialogue between Faustus and Mephistopheles in that play, and then the dialogue between the devil and Jean here, they kind of circled in some similar ways, and then in Dr. Faustus, he uses the magic that the devil gives him to do very selfish, stupid things, like to play pranks on kings and queens and to like curry their favor. And in the end, he's like, "Oh no, I made a mistake," and he gets carted off to hell. And here, she uses her magic to help other people, and she's punished, but she doesn't really, like, she dies physically, but there's this implication that her spirit lives on in some way. And it's interesting that, you know, the gender relation, one, a male magician versus a female magician, and two, just, you know, the Western notion of, you know, if you deal with the magic of Satanism versus this, I mean, not only because it was from Japan, but look at the time period, the 70s, when Wicca and witchcraft and Satanism were coming back into vogue, you know, sort of rebellious subculture. I think if it were made in any other time, not even just any other place, it would be different. So I think it was kind of a perfect storm.
Exactly, yeah. I feel like there's, like we mentioned earlier, the pink film, the Pinkuega, is already kind of meant to be disruptive, and it's in just its execution. But to see this almost Japanese take on these demons and not being as strictly evil like we see them, I think is an interesting juxtaposition and a very interesting take on this kind of story. Okay, so lastly, the thing I think we haven't really covered a whole lot is what do we think about the eroticism of the film as a whole? Do you think they enhanced the overall presentation, or were they just kind of, you know, cheesy, maybe not fan servicey, but, you know, cheesy and unnecessary?
I think it's an erotically charged film. I don't think it's a pornographic film. I don't even necessarily think it's an erotic film, because all of the sexuality is so caked in metaphor and surrealism that it's not necessarily, but there is this sort of, because there's this sex positive vibe in it in places. Like, again, for a movie that has 2 rape scenes, there is also this sex positivity to it that when you watch it, I think you feel sexy watching it. That's such a weird thing to say, but like you feel this sort of like, yes, be liberated, be a libertine, be a hedonist, you know, enjoy your body, enjoy, you know, the power, you know, it comes through sexuality. And at the same time, it's like, you feel this while you're watching, you know, a Schoolhouse Rock vignette, you know, it's very weird. I think it's a movie, like I said, that makes you feel sexual, not like, oh yeah, I watched this movie and now I want to go bang, but it gives you this sort of body positivity, this feeling of, you know, it's okay. It sort of feels like it lifts this curtain of shame in places that I think we feel. And in that, I think it succeeds in being an erotic film. It's a film that says it is okay to embrace the erotic, but it's not necessarily. At no point is the Belladonna working on her spells and potions, and the pizza man come for a special delivery. It's more of a, you know, embracing sexuality through metaphor, and I think that is what makes it so powerful.
I slightly have to disagree with you on that, with the sex positive thing. I think Belladonna comes to embrace her sexuality after going through the sexual trauma that she does. And I think that can be empowering, but I would say the sex positive stuff doesn't really happen until the very end of the movie. For most of the movie, it's not sex positive. It's not really until the final third. But as for the eroticism, I would say it's part of the art aesthetic. And I think there's nothing that, as Sully was saying, of just like it's trying to turn you on. I think the closest to that is just Belladonna embracing her sexuality when she becomes a witch, and just accepting of her body and of her powers.
Right. I think it's kind of a mix. I agree that it's not a pornographic film and that it's not meant to get you going. But I feel like there's enough sexual energy throughout that, I mean, you kind of have to pick up on. And there's a lot of... It's a very messy film in that regard. I feel like when we look at its sex overall, it's a very messy thing to begin with. You've got a very, very tough scenes. You've got a lot of very sexually positive scenes. There's a lot of just individual things, not as part of the entire, violent scenes as a whole, that can be titillating. I don't feel, again, that it's not there to just to go ahead and get you off, but I feel like there's bits of energy that you can pick up on that sort of add to... When
you watch this movie, you get this sort of feeling, like the movie is almost inviting you. It's almost inviting you to embrace your body and your sexuality. It's not showing porn, and it's not saying go out and bang someone. It's saying just be free and just enjoy it, and don't feel guilt and shame, and don't there's this power inside of you that you can harness for your own satisfaction. It's this sort of it's casting a spell, one might say.
No, that's a good way to put it. There's a lot of little bits there that do kind of enrapture one, but it never jumps fully overboard into pornographic content.
It's funny, just kind of compared to modern anime, where I think sex is seen as very juvenile. Like, look at these big breasts, and also the constant male gaze that happens throughout modern anime, whereas this is very much a messy but mature and very adult look at sexuality, which I don't think we rarely get in modern anime today.
Tobias, when you wrote these discussion questions, you say, do you feel like something like Belladonna could be made in the current industry? And my answer is no. And to piggyback off what Bill says, I mean, I feel like how the anime industry right now is handling sexuality is, like, is a juvenile. It's very much only for straight men. It's very, very infantile and very sort of, like, I think about, like, on Twitter, people saying, oh, lewd. No, well, that's what it is. It's lewd. It's not even, like, tasteful. It's so pathetic and kind of sad, and I think this movie has this sort of, like, higher-minded look at it, and it's like, this movie, I see the sort of anime industry and even the culture of it now saying, oh, sex is dirty and naughty, hee, and then I see this movie saying sex is beautiful and powerful and something that, is almost like magic, and I think that's the sort of difference, and just where the industry is now, I could not see a movie like this being made. It would not cater to the otaku tastes, and it's an art movie before it is anything. And I also could see it not being made in maybe another country's animated, oeuvre. I could not see that happening. I could not see any American studio making a film like this.
No, I agree completely. I would be very surprised if we were to get something like this. But just sort of, I guess, since I think we definitely all agree that a more subtly erotic film like this, in certain ways, not to say that there's any subtlety in some of the scenes, but something that's not outright pornographic, while we all agree that would definitely not fit in the industry today, do we think that something as arty as this film is would be made today in general, whether sexual or not?
I think there are beautiful anime films that have come out in the last few years. I think of, like, Your Name and Silent Voice, but those are still... I don't think of those as art house. I think they're just very well done animated films. I think... Unfortunately, there's not much that we are privy to, because I am sure there are plenty of art house Japanese films and plenty of art house animated Japanese films even that are being made that just do not reach the Western shores like we would like them to, and that maybe we would have to be, in the know in that sort of world to be privy to them. So whether or not there are, I will say that, are these films being made and are they being brought to the U.S. either by official channels such as, distributors or licensors, or even by fans who are fan subbing them anyway? No, I would say right now there isn't.
I would disagree to some degree. I think it's rare. I think there is some art house that's happening. Like, Tobias, you turned me on to Kaiba. I would say its aesthetic is not typical anime animation. It's very much its own style, and it's not a typical anime story that's set in a high school. It's a dystopian view of the world, and the interpretation of memory and who you actually are. And there is a bit of use of sex that happen in that show.
No, I would agree. Yeah, in episode 2, there is a flat out sex scene that is, I guess, if taken literally, can be a little raunchy, but it doesn't really feel as pornographic as it could be were it given a very photorealistic art style.
Yeah, or stuff that's made from 4C in their experimental work. So I think art house anime does exist. I think it's just very rare because the money's not there as more general shonen anime would be.
So at that point, you mentioned Kaiba, and I completely agree with Kaiba. But Bill, I'm going to make you feel old now. Kaiba is over 10 years old.
Oh. Well, that's still relatively young-ish.
Yeah, that is true. When I think of things like, it came out in this sort of new anime movie renaissance, in the post-Your Name world, I think those are very realism-based high school dramas. Seems to be a lot of it. Things like Your Name and Silent Voice, which can be just filled as much drama as Belladonna, but is very different aesthetically. I'm glad that Yuasa is getting the love he deserves, but we are getting stuff that's closer to Your Name rather than Kaiba with his more recent stuff.
This might be a tangent, but how does Devilman Crybaby relate to Belladonna of Sadness?
Well, I would say that there's a lot of intense sexual imagery throughout that show. I feel like there's a lot of rough sexual elements. So the Crybaby is, in some ways, it's very erotic overall, but a lot of the power dynamics between the main characters and even how the main character, Rio, right?
Akira is Devilman, and Rio is gay Satan.
Yeah, so there is a lot of power struggle between the Crybaby and gay Satan there, where Akira is very much this innocent soul that is constantly seeing all this bad stuff happen, and he gets a lot of brief touches of sexuality. Of course, when he turns full Devilman and sports that huge erection throughout the school, but even seeing his crush / childhood friend start to engage in these gravure type of stuff. There's a bit of jealousy that comes through there, and a lot of that empathy, that hyper empathy that he's known for, sort of bleeds through. And I feel like even though there's not a lot of eroticism throughout some of those parts, there's still a lot of sexually charged energy that we see in that drama.
And I think it's also, how do we define something as being avant-garde or art house, or being an art film, as opposed to, or being an art series even, as opposed to, even though I think Devilman has that level of surreality and transgression and artistry behind it, I think it's not necessarily an art series. And that's not to say it's a bad series, or to say that it's not worthy of discussion or critique, or to say it's even not art. It's just, it's like saying it's a different genre almost compared to something like Belladonna. Even compared to the other two films in the Anime-Rama trilogy, Belladonna, it's almost like, why is this film with these other two? These two are, sort of, grindhouse anime, and then you have Belladonna, which is art house anime.
Adding on to how sexuality is viewed within anime today, on top of it being kind of juvenile, I think the only real evolution that's happened, and this evolution, even by my standards, is probably like 10 years old, is where there's slightly more, there's finally starting to be more of, let's not just do the male gaze, let's do gaze for the females. Franchises like Free or Yuri on Ice, which at this point are pretty old, but that's starting to, or stuff like idol shows, which aren't inherently sexual, but there's a show for females and members of the LGBTQ community to have something for them to gaze over.
And I think even though that's growing, and that's certainly becoming a thing, like I've even seen just this sort of explosion, people are starting to sort of market towards the Fujoji sector, and because LGBT rights in Japan are becoming more visible in many ways. There's actually a very wonderful documentary called Queer Japan that's just come out, so check that out too while you're at it. Even though we're getting that, I still think the anime industry is catering mostly towards men, like 80% of the time, maybe 90%, and even then, the question that many sort of feminists would say is, why should there be any gays at all? Like, why does it have to? Why does equality have to be, we can look at men in the same way? Why can't equality be, we view this in this way instead of that way? And that's, I don't know how I feel about that. I kind of agree with it, but I'm also at the same time like, I will settle for Yuri on Ice being part of, having a female gaze. And some people say there is no such thing as a female gaze, it does not exist. And then there are some people, such as I've said, the filmmaker Anna Biller, who I mentioned at the top of the show, she, disagrees and says, no, there is a female gaze, and I'm trying to find it, and I'm trying to define it, and put it out into the public consciousness. And when I think of anime, though, I think that the otaku culture, though I've been reading the book Little Boy, which is basically about the last exhibition of super flat art by Takashi Murakami, and there's a series of essays in it, and a variety of artists being profiled, and there are many women who are writing these essays and being profiled as artists and talking about their contributions to otaku culture and to this art. And I feel like even though that has always been there have always been otaku women and queer otaku. They've been kind of sidelined and ignored, and their histories have been erased. And so much of the industry now, as it has become this sort of Ouroboros of otaku culture of, constant consumption of the same regurgitated material, that they're being left out, and that there is no room for something like Belladonna, or even, like, what if there were to be a queer version of Belladonna? Could it exist? I don't think in the current climate it could. So I think that's certainly a way of looking at it. And I really feel like even though people are like, oh yeah, now we can lewd men now, I'm like, no, that was never the point here. This was never what to me we should have been aiming for. But I guess one must take one's victories where you can find them.
I think the closest we got to a queer Belladonna would be Devilman Crybaby. While not stylistically similar, I feel like they both have this main character that goes through way too much stuff than they signed up for. They both handle it in the best possible way they could, but they are kind of forced by the people around them who desire them in some way or another to make these hard choices. And they see a lot of pain, a lot of suffering in the people around them in that process. And it's both thanks to Satan. In both works, Satan is present.
For the devil takes a pleasing shape.
I do have one last kind of question that's kind of heavy. Is with Belladonna of Sadness uses sexual violence as part of its narrative. Sexual violence, I think, does occur within modern anime. You could look at the Duraro reboot that happened this past year. There is an episode where you see one of the characters, not the main characters, but a female character that they meet gets sexually assaulted. Or in it's a little bit older, but the new Berserk movies, the final third movie is just a very graphic sexual assault that happens. And I think it's a complicated issue of just how do you handle sexual violence. Some people feel that scenes such as sexual assault and rape shouldn't be included in narratives. I don't know where you guys stand on that. I think scenes like that should, if you're going to put them in there, they should have a purpose and not just be there to be there. Because I think that is very crude and cruel just to put that in there if you have no purpose at all. Whereas I think Sully, you've pretty well illustrated the sexual assault and rape scenes that happen in Belladonna of Sadness have a point. But I think in modern animes, it's there to be there to get you emotionally charged.
As bad as it is to have a sexual assault scene for titillation, it is almost as bad to have it as a cheap emotional charge. Like, it's similar to fridging women in comics, you know, oh, I've killed your girlfriend, therefore the stakes have been raised. It's easy to do that, and I think when a woman is the author of the text, whatever that text may be, a book, a film, an anime, a series, whatever. If it is a woman in the helm or a woman who has experienced that, I think, this film was mostly made by men, and I still think it handles it very well. Personally, there are people who disagree with me. This movie is very controversial, and I think that being controversial also does not keep it from being a bad. There are many people who I think now, in the age we live in, where they would say Belladonna has not one but two scenes where sexual assault occurs. It is a bad movie, we should ban it, and we should never talk about it, and I think that's absolutely wrong. This is a brilliant film, it should be talked about, and there are feminists who talk about this movie, and there are scholars who talk about this movie, and I think the difference is how it's done and how it's framed and how it's done in the narrative. This is part of the story. It is not the main focus, but it is part of Jean's degradation as a woman. She is used by the society and by the ruler of that society, and her power stems from the depths of the depravity that she has to face. It is not done for the cheap emotional charge of, this is bad, therefore you should feel bad, and it's not done for the male audience to find some sort of salacious satisfaction from it. And I think that's what makes the difference, and I think that's what we're not seeing here now, because I do not want to live in a world where we cannot tell a woman creator, you are allowed to express your trauma or your experience in art. You cannot do this because it makes people uncomfortable. I don't think I would want to live in such a world. But I also do not like the world we live in now, where we see sexual violence as a cheap way to get someone to care about a character, or even worse, and I see this very frequently in the community, it is a source of titillation. Unwanted, unconsensual view of women's bodies in media, the panty shot, the groping. I think we need to move past that. It's so juvenile, and sometimes I really just wish I could just go and get on my little soapbox and say, I wish all of you would just grow up. This is why none of you will ever have actual relationships, is because you live in this fantasy world where you think that people's bodies are for your consumption only, and that they're not autonomous beings of their own. Or automatopoeia beings, as some people would pronounce it, apparently. I had to lighten it up. It got kind of dark there.
Again, sex is a very messy subject, and it's very easy to just put everything into these buckets of this is good views on sex and this is bad views on sex, and it's a little too messy to put in those black and white buckets. Mm-hmm. I will say, and again, on a podcast here of cis males, that it's a little weird for me to be talking about that, and I understand. I completely agree, though, that if it is just used as a plot device, that it's lazy and it's just kind of cashing in on a very, quote unquote, bad, awful thing, and this is a bad, awful thing we're using for character reasons. But I agree with Sully that this is a thing that happens, that has happened, and unfortunately will continue to happen. And that if we do not allow these victims to express this in some way, then I think that's denying art. I think a lot of art is suffering, and not that anybody should suffer for the sake of such art. But if it's a human experience, unfortunately, And if it's a situation like this where it has to be, sublimated in some way and in the text, whether it be actual text or a movie, then I think that is very much a valid place for it. And there is very much a valid place for tough subjects like this. I don't think they should be erased. But like Sully said, I feel like there is a disconnect between exploring these tough subjects and these subjects that are parallel to more titillating sort of aspects, and crossing that bridge into actually, being pornographic. So to kind of key off what you said there at the end, I feel like, it's like I said, it's not just an easy, yes and this. Like, yes, actual sexual assault is bad, but there are time and places to share these stories, and for both victims and people that aren't victims to read about it and sort of share in this disgust and these situations. Even as someone myself that has not been the victim of sexual assault, seeing movies like this and seeing it depicted, and is in other media where it's depicted as such, it's very disgusting to watch. And I feel like that's the emotion that these kind of things are supposed to dredge up. This emotion of disgust that's tied very close to like sexual urges, that is supposed to make you like question those and question how you see these sort of things.
Yeah, I think sexual violence can't be, when it comes to a narrative, it can't be put in a box of it. Yes, it should be in there all the time, or no, it should be never shown. It has to be there on a purpose and for its narrative. And I think Belladonna of Sadness, reflecting on it and hearing Sully, I think you brilliantly explaining it, I think Belladonna of Sadness uses sexual assault as part of its narrative for the right reasons. But I also understand for people who have gone through that, and it does feel weird as a cis white male talking about this, but for people who have gone through that, I understand it's a traumatic experience, and if you don't like it in your media, I completely understand it, and why you wouldn't want to go through that and see that in your media. So.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like I think giving that trigger warning at the beginning of this podcast is there are people that just can't do it. They just won't do it, and that's completely understandable.
So, do we have any other topics to go on with this? We got really dark there again for a minute.
Well, I think the movie itself can be very dark, so I think it's a very good discussion. I think we've kind of wrapped it up there. I guess, as usual, we can close off sort of the discussion of the movie with what our one iconic scene, our one most memorable scene. So, Sully, I think you mentioned yours earlier, but I forgot already. What was your one iconic scene of this movie?
I think the moment when you see Jeanne in the form of this sort of black stag, and then she sort of morphs into the black robe with the horn. She looks a bit like Maleficent almost. I think that, and she's looking down on the villagers and the noblewoman. I think that was sort of like this, and I think they sort of use that scene for the Japanese poster too. I think that was the scene that really stands out to me. If not that, then I would say definitely the first scene with the phallic imp. that one kind of has lingered in my mind.
That's a really good one. I think her sitting there as that beast, that black beast, was very visually stunning. I think the scene following that, with just the weird orgy, it also kind of stands out to me very, very vividly. But I think overall, it's just the entire first half of the movie, and later, but it kind of diminishes in quantity later. But just the sheer amount of those illustrations with the watercolors present throughout, the very simple lines, that the choice of colors juxtapose the lack of colors, and you definitely notice that creates these scenes that I just have not seen in any other anime. To be fair, you see these kind of often in picture books, maybe fairy tale stories. But just nothing in an anime is just so unique, I feel like, even 40-something years later.
I think for me, well, this isn't a visually stunning scene. It sticks in my mind too much of just when Belladonna is being chased by the not being chased, but she's banging on her on her door where her husband's on the other side, just like, please let me in. I'm going to get hurt. I need to get away. Please help me. And he's drowning in his own sorrow. That scene just, it really stuck with me.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of sense of betrayal there, I feel like. I couldn't quite get, and I think this is maybe up to the audience's interpretation. Like, was he holding the door closed intentionally, or was he so passed out drunk that he had no clue what was going on?
I can't remember the scene well enough, so I can't answer that.
Yeah, no, it's something kind of stuck with me. I think that I agree with Bill in that way. That was it intentional, or was he just so out of it? And honestly, I feel like either one of those could possibly be true in that interpretation.
Kind of as our wrap up, I think Sully, you're exactly right in that this film has multiple layers to it in its narrative of examining the patriarchy, examining the power dynamics, in examining the power dynamic of sex. You could look at it through a religious point of view, if you want to. And I think on top of that, just the icing on the cake is the beautiful visuals that kind of entrance you as you watch this transformation from woman to Wiccan.
Well, before we go into kind of wrapping up here with our social media and our Patreon and all that, I just want to point out that the film is more readily available than I thought it was. Because apparently, Bill, you watched this on Amazon Prime?
It's on Amazon Prime, of all places. I was shocked as you are that it was there.
And if you're like me and you don't trust Amazon like at all, you can also find this at Arballos Films. It was put out by Cinelicious Pictures, but their distribution is now handled by Arballos. That is ARBELOS films.com, and if you go there, you can actually buy the Blu-ray for $29, which is actually pretty good, for a restored, remastered version of this film. It comes with an interview with the director and the art director and the composer, a 16-page booklet, and all the trailers. And they also have like a one-sheet style poster for the film for sale as well. It's not the original Japanese; it's one that they've created for themselves, but it's still beautiful, and it's $20. So, go and get yourself something nice. This is also the same distributor who does Funeral Parade of Roses, so if you went to my Japanese film panel at all at Animazement, that was the film that I forced people to watch, and they also distribute that movie for the same price. So, go there, get Belladonna of Sadness on Blu-ray, and get Funeral Parade of Roses. Just go full Japanese art house and get the poster so that you too can subject all your friends to your taste. Like I do.
If you like what we're doing, we have started a Patreon. We did it, everybody. Internet law has happened.
We finally succumbed to consumerism.
As one internet law I like to say is, eventually, if you're doing something on the internet, whether that be a podcast or YouTube, you must start a Patreon. It is internet law. But yeah, our Patreon just started up where you can come support us. It'll help us with the cost of doing this podcast and help us get to more conventions. So if you like what we're doing, please go over there and check our reward tiers. I think we're going to be doing shout-outs pretty soon.
I have a shout-out, actually. So, close to my time at the retail job I'm at, we had a photo center from Fujifilm, and the guy came out to check the photo center, and his name was CJ, and we got into a really great discussion about anime, and he's like, I'm going to listen to your podcast. So I said, I'm going to give you a shout out, and even though this is the very end of this episode, don't know if he'll hear it, but CJ from Fujifilm, this is for you. Thank you for listening, hopefully. I don't know, you could have been lying to
Awesome. Well, if you don't like Patreon, we also have a Ko-Fi that you can give us a couple bucks, and whatever you can give, if you can give, we would really appreciate it. Now, gentlemen, what are your social media handles?
So mine, as usual, is Reverend _Tobias. That is my Twitter. You get me up there. On Facebook, I mostly hang out in the Third Impact Anime community group. So if you're more of a Facebook addict, we have a group, just Third Impact Anime community. You can join there, and we basically post links to relevant news and kind of talk about various anime-related subjects. So feel free to hit us up there if Facebook is more your speed compared to Twitter.
You can find me at WB Foreman as in FOREMAN 999 at Twitter, where you'll mostly see me retweeting and loving Lupin fan art and all my things about Lupin the Third, my greatest love, and all my other whatever is making me tick anime-wise and video game-wise on Twitter. I would also like you to go check out our website, www.thirdimpactanime.com, where we write occasional articles. We don't have anything going on for the season currently. I might write something. I have some ideas in the works, but
bless you, Bill. Bless you for keeping the blog alive.
Hey, I love writing, even though I'm horrible with grammar and spelling. I love writing it. The last thing I wrote, it's a little dated, but I think it's still fun, is go check out my observations from this year's E3, where I talk about how Netflix is invading the gaming space with everything going to streaming, and all my other wild observations.
And you can find me at Calvakun, that is CALVA_KUN on Twitter. If you find a picture of a beautiful young man with a Duranjo mask on, that's me. I'm also thinking about making, is it Kitsu or Kitsune? The anime, it's like the new version of my anime list that everyone's going. I think I might do that, because I hated my anime list with a burning passion, and everyone was on there and never kept up. Maybe that'll be something I actually keep up. And I'm hoping, like I said, I'm going to be reading Witch Hat Atelier, the new manga that has come out, and I'm going to force myself to write a review of the first volume, because I really should write more as someone who wants to do writing or be an editor professionally. So yeah, I do mostly personal writing. So I've neglected my duties on the site, but much like Bill, hopefully, if I say it here on the podcast, they'll force me to do it.
Join me, Sully, in the writing corner. Join me.
That sounds so weird and dark.
One of us.
Are you Satan?
And as usual, you can check out more Third Impact musings we mentioned on the website. Bill mentioned the Patreon, but I don't remember you giving the URL. So in case he didn't, in case I'm forgetting, and in case you need to hear it again anyway, it is patreon.com/thirdimpactanime. And we are also on Ko-fi. That is ko-fi.com/thirdimpactanime. So whether or not you want to regularly give us money once a month, or buy Austin a coffee, because let's be honest, he's the one getting this money, you can do so either way. But likewise, you can find this podcast either through our website, thirdimpactanime.com, or on Podbean as well. Search for Third Impact Anime. You have to give us the full title, but in the most dramatic way.
La sorcière, Kaneshimi no Belladonna.